Namo Buddhaya, Jai Bhim. So I'm sitting here in the Padmaloka shrine room on a beautiful spring day with some friends in the Padmaloka community, and this is a talk being especially recorded to my dear friends at the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. It's going out for sangha night. I'm due to visit Sheffield because I'm the president of the Sheffield Buddhist Centre, but I'm due to visit Sheffield in May, but that's not going to happen because of this coronavirus crisis and because of the lockdown that we're in. I'm going to be here at Padmaloka, and I'm not going to be going anywhere else. None of us are going to be going anywhere else for what looks like quite a long time. So we're here enjoying really wonderful conditions for practice and friendship and study and work on Padmaloka. And from time to time we're also communicating with the world beyond our grounds, and I am in touch with friends in Sheffield, and as many of you will know listening to this talk, I'm very, very fond of the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I love going to Sheffield. This title, President, is not a title I particularly like. I prefer just to see myself as a good friend of the centre. And I come to Sheffield and get as much from being in Sheffield as I give to Sheffield, if not more. It's a lovely city and a really good centre. And it's coming twice a year to the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. They are among the highlights of my year, so I'm really sorry not to be with you at this time. But here I am, coming from Padmaloka, far away, and at a different time. Time is very strange during this lockdown period. I won't tell you when I'm speaking, where it is in relation to you sitting in front of your screens and listening to this, but time is very, very weird for us here at Padmaloka. Weeks go by and we don't quite have a sense of what they mean. One community member said it's almost like there's just one day and you just get up and you go to bed and you do the different things, but it's just one day. That's what it's like for us. So we're in this sort of timeless zone, but we are very aware of, to the extent we can be, of what's going on outside in the world and the suffering that people are undergoing and this sense of isolation that people are undergoing. It's a very, very strange and troubling time for the world. It's also a time of great opportunity, I think. It's very easy for me to say that, living here in these wonderful conditions. Saying it's an opportunity to some people might be a bit upsetting when they have the demands and challenges that they have in relation to their family or their job, especially if they're involved with care work or concerns about their financial future. We have those concerns. We don't know what the future will bring to us either. But nonetheless, it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us as Buddhists to look more deeply into the nature of the Dharma at a time like this when so much is taken away. Precisely because so much is being taken away, in a sense, the Dharma grows more vivid because we can discover what is truly reliable, what we can rely upon in this life. Certainly, my own study during this period has intensified in different ways. I'm doing a series of talks on the Bodhicharyavatara. I'm doing other studies to do with other talks that I'm giving. And in the community, we're studying the Bodhicharyavatara every Sunday morning, the whole community, all 18 of us. But one of the things I've also been reflecting upon is the life of the Buddha, particularly the time of his enlightenment and just before his enlightenment, his life story generally. And we're moving in the direction now of celebrating Vaishakha Purnima, the full moon of Vaishak, the month of the Indian month of Vaishak, and we call it Buddha Day, the celebration of the Buddha's enlightenment, because traditionally it's said that the Buddha gained enlightenment on the full moon of Vaishaka Purnima. And I thought that the talk that I'd like to give you today is related to your theme on Dharma in troubled times, Dharma for troubled times. But I want to go back to the early life of the Buddha. I think there is so much we can learn for the Dharma in troubled times through contemplating the pre-enlightenment life of the Buddha. You're very familiar with the different stories, the life in the palace, the 4 sights, the going forth, the period with his teachers, with asceticism, and then discovering enlightenment. And there are different versions of it in different traditions. But recently, I've gone back to a particular text or a passage of a text that I've always found very enjoyable to read and very vivid to read. It's from the 2nd century. It's a long Sanskrit poem written in very, very high Sanskrit. I think they call it Kavya literature. Kavya literature is a very rich tradition of Sanskrit poetry written in classical Sanskrit. This is the Buddha Charita of Ashvaghosha, the Buddha Charita, the Acts of the Buddha of Ashvaghosha. And I want to just talk about a passage from the section which is devoted to the Abhinishkramana. The Abhinishkramana means the great going forth. It's a very important phase, obviously, in the Buddha's life. And one of the things Ashvaghosha does, he's grounding himself on the old sources, probably the old Pali sources and the Sanskrit equivalent, the themes of the life of the Buddha, but he weaves it into a poem. So this is 2nd century. This is very, very early on in the history of Buddhism. And he weaves a narrative of great beauty based on the earliest sources. So the background, of course, is that Siddhartha Gautama is in the palace. He's got everything he could possibly imagine. He's richly brought up. He's got everything he needs to live the life of luxury as befitting a great prince who's going to inherit the kingdom. And in this particular story, in Ashvaghosha's version of the story, it's not that he's, some of the stories say that he's never allowed out because his father wants to protect him from bad sights that might, change his course. But in this particular story, he does go out. He gets on his horse, his steed, the steed of steeds, Kantaka, and he rides out with some friends. Let me just read to you the way Ashvaghosha describes it. Desire for the distant forest, as well as the excellence of the land, led him to the more distant jungle land. So he's riding out. He's got some friends behind him, and he comes across something. So he's riding out to the distant jungle land, and he saw soil being ploughed, with its surface broken, with the tracks of the furrows like waves of water. When he saw the ground in this state, with the young grass torn up and scattered by the ploughs, and littered with dead worms, insects, and other little creatures, he mourned deeply as at the slaughter of his own kindred. And seeing the men ploughing, with their bodies discoloured by the wind, dust, and the sun's rays, and seeing the oxen in distress with the labour of drawing, the most noble one felt extreme compassion. Then getting down from his fleet-footed horse, he walked slowly over the ground, overcome with grief. And as he considered how life comes into existence and passes away, hurting, he uttered, how pitiful this is. And so it's a very, vivid description of the prince, of the Bodhisattva, as the Buddha is called before his enlightenment, riding out, beautiful landscape, he's going further out into the jungle, and then he comes across a field being ploughed. And he's just incredibly moved by seeing these old ploughmen and the old oxen ripping up the soil, ripping up the land, and the insects and worms being killed. And it really affects him very, very deeply. It gets right through to him. There is, I think, in Ashwagosha's description, almost a visionary quality to what he's writing. So the Buddha is being shown very vividly, he's seeing very vividly how life ends in death. Life ends here in slaughter. And there also is this toil of the ploughman and the oxen. It's very interesting that enlightenment, nirvana, is called the state of yoga kshema, or yoga kema in Pali, which means ease from exertion. Ease from exertion. Yoga here means exertion. It's related to the word yoke, as in the yoke on the neck of an ox. So the samsara is regarded as something terribly tiring and exhausting, terrible sort of labour. Greed, hatred, and delusion. When we cycle around those, there's a terrible labour and heaviness. And nirvana is described as ease, complete ease and rest and liberation from that. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. But the Buddha is seeing this in that vision as a young man. Something is really getting through to him. And I also find it very interesting, this detail. He mourns deeply at the slaughter, at the death of all these little creatures, as at the slaughter of his own kindred. He feels that connected with the life around him, with that destruction. He feels it as if it were his own, if it was happening to his own family. We'll come back to that a bit later. And yes, he felt extreme compassion. Krupa is the Sanskrit word, which means sort of trembling with. That's the word for that. Extreme. Parama krupa. Parama. Extreme trembling with. So this is the Buddha riding out and seeing this. And in a sense, I find Ashwagosha's description more perhaps credible in some ways than some of the very formal ways it's described in other texts. You can imagine, perhaps we could imagine ourselves one day going for a walk somewhere and seeing something, maybe seeing a ploughed field or, just seeing something in nature, people in the street or something like that. And suddenly you see there's suffering here. There's something not right here. And it's not just to do with that moment. It's to do with life generally. Anyway, the text goes on. And his response is this, and desiring to reach perfect clearness with his mind. We can be affected by these things, and sometimes that can lead to depression. And perhaps that's going on at the moment, when we read the news, when we hear about friends, and, when we see the state of the world, the response can be perhaps feeling sometimes depressed and flat, and what's the point? Siddhartha's response, the Bodhisattva's response, is desire to reach perfect clearness of mind. This situation, it's no good just getting depressed. You've got to get clarity. And he stops his friends who are with him. He says, he doesn't want them with him. This is an interesting detail. He needs, if you like, his space. He needs to go somewhere alone for a bit to get clear about what's going on. Sometimes we need to do that. So he stopped his friends who were following him and proceeded himself to a solitary spot at a root of a solitary rose apple tree, the jambu tree, whose beautiful leaves were fluttering all around. And there he sat upon the clean, verdant earth, with grass bright like emeralds. And while reflecting how the living world arises and passes away, he took the path of mental stillness. And his mind at once came to a stand, and he was instantly released from worries, such as those associated with desire for objects. He entered the first dhyana of calmness, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, and which is free from polluting influences. This is a really interesting sort of transition. He's seen this terrible situation. Not just the field, not just the ploughing, not just the death of these lovely creatures, but he's seeing that this is life. This is what life is like. We are born, we get sick, we die, there is suffering. He gets clear, he enters dhyana. I think there's an enormously important detail here in relation to things. Some people might think, well, the Buddha's just running away. He's just trying to ignore what's going on. Not at all. You'll see, that in a minute. He knows very, very well he has to be composed. The mind has to calm down. He has to enter dhyana. He has to become integrated and absorbed and, yes, filled with more positive emotion. The scene has moved him in that way, to move to something higher, to a higher state, to get a perspective on what's going on. I think there's a teaching here, for all of us at the moment. We need to find a perspective. It's very easy to react and to panic when there are difficulties, when we're sick or when others are sick or when the world is in trouble. The last thing we can do sometimes is find that vantage point of a higher perspective. So the Bodhisattva is teaching us here to find that perspective, find that vision. And the text goes on. Then he attained samadhi, so full concentration and absorption, which is born of seclusion. Viveka is the term here, very important words. We're talking about social isolation. Well, in a way that's viveka, more positively. The positive withdrawal, from distractions, going more and more absorbed into skillfulness. That's what dhyana is. So he attains samadhi, which is born of seclusion and yields perfect ecstasy and bliss. Again, this is important. If you're going to find that perspective, you have to find that sense of rapture, ecstasy, bliss, happiness, contentment inside yourself. Again, it's no good if we're going to find a response to things, if we just fall into, suffering. We won't be able to do anything for ourselves or others in that state. So what this is describing is this movement to this higher, happier, blissful perspective. And then, clearly seeing the way the world goes, he reflected deeply. Oh, how pitiable it is that human beings who are themselves helpless and subject to sickness, aging and death, should, because of their ignorance and blindness of their conceit, feel disgusted at another who is afflicted by sickness, old age and death. For I, being like that myself, should feel disgusted by another in the same condition. That would not be worthy of me or conduce to my knowing the ultimate truth. Whilst he thus gained perfect insight into the afflictions of sickness, old age and death, the intoxication with the self arising from his health, youth and life instantly evaporated. This is a brilliant bit of writing by Ashvaghosha. It's a sort of brilliant sort of synthesis of traditional teachings. He's shown the Buddha entering that dhyana beneath the rose apple tree in response to a vision of old age, in the vision of the impermanence of life, the suffering of life. He shows how he becomes absorbed, and then he starts to reflect. This very, very simple reflection, how people, because of their ignorance, because of their blindness, because of their conceit, because of their intoxication with themselves, the word is mada, their intoxication with themselves, when they're presented with the facts of life, the difficult facts of life, the afflictions of life, sometimes when we're presented with the sickness of another, we can feel a certain sense of disgust. We don't want to open to that person. We don't want to respond to that person. An aging person, somebody really struggling with the effects of age, especially older people. Again, there's a sense of not wanting to respond, to want to close off. And of course, a dying person or a dead person, we can do the same, because we're so attached, we're so caught up with our health and youth and strength, our relative health, youth, strength, with our life itself. This is gone into as a reflection in some of the Pali texts, where the Buddha it's called the removal of the three vanities or the three intoxications. But I love the way Ashvaghosha weaves these things together, this whole sort of sequence of events in the Bodhisattva's life. And sometimes, of course, when we read the life of the Buddha, especially if you read the older texts, although I think it's a misinterpretation, people can sometimes think that the Buddha's compassion only comes after his enlightenment. It can even be used as an argument. Well, don't concentrate on trying to benefit other people. Get enlightened and then come back and help people. But I don't think that's really borne out from texts like this, which are based on the oldest texts. What the reflection here of the Bodhisattva is on the sameness of self and other. Everybody is subject to sickness, aging, death. I too am subject to sickness, aging and death. There is no difference between us and the rest of life. But it's being done from a perspective, this higher perspective of dhyana, this very positive perspective. Sangharakshita has this, he likes quoting Alfred Lord Tennyson, the Victorian poet, describing compassion as a painless sympathy with pain. And I think that's a very, very good expression, because if we were in pain like everybody else, we'd be defined by it. We wouldn't be able to help people. But if we can have this deep sympathy, this deep empathy, this sense of sameness, and retain this higher perspective, we can really do something. We can really be of benefit long term to others. And here with Siddhartha, all these intoxications with health, youth and life instantly evaporated. Very, very important time in the Buddha's life. And of course, in some traditions, it was recollecting the rose apple experience, as it's sometimes called, that gets him back on the path to enlightenment. He'd forgotten this experience and he'd lost his way with extreme ascetic practice. But here, Ashvaghosha is giving us a deeper insight into this experience. It's not simply, according to him, an experience of dhyana. It's actually an experience of insight, of a direct vision into the nature of things. So then we get his response to this. He says, or Ashvaghosha says, in response to this experience, he felt neither thrill nor pang. There was no doubt, nor sloth, nor drowsiness. He was not dyed by passion for sensual desires, and neither did he hate or look down upon others. So in that moment he'd freed himself from all of those hindrances and poisons. While this pure, dustless state of mind grew within his lofty soul, Ashwagosha doesn't mind using the word Atman here, take it poetically. While this pure, dustless state of mind grew within his lofty soul, there came unseen by the other men a man dressed in mendicant's clothes. So here he is, he's had this experience, he's in this deep meditation, and then somebody turns up. The word for mendicant is bhikkhu. It doesn't mean bhikkhu in the full, Buddhist sense. It means a homeless wanderer wearing rags, who lives on alms, who begs his food. He just turns up. Only, it seems, does the Bodhisattva see him. The prince asked him, "Tell me, who are you? Tell me who you are." The mendicant replied, "O bull among men, I am a Shramana, who, alarmed by birth and death, has left home and gone forth for the sake of liberation." Alarmed by birth and death. Alarmed by birth and death. This is the great sort of theme, really, in the life of the Buddha, being alarmed by birth and death. Well, at the moment we feel alarmed by that, don't we? We feel alarmed by the fact that life ends in death, or seems to be ending in death for a lot of people, or seems to have reached a point of great difficulty because all the usual things aren't working. And yes, we do need to respond to, the needs of people immediately, but there's a deeper question. There's a much deeper question, because even when this particular crisis comes to an end, we still have the problem of birth and death. We still have the problem of life ending in death. We still have those age-old, timeless problems, which demands us to ask, what are we doing with our life? At least that question. What is this life really for? What's its purpose? That's what a mendicant is. That's what a Shramana is. Somebody who's left home and in the Indian tradition and gone forth to live on begged food. They want to solve the riddle of life and death. What is this life for? What's its meaning? What does it mean to be liberated from all this? What is, as it were, salvation in relation to all this? So the mendicant goes on. Desiring liberation from a world marked by decay, I seek that blessed, indestructible state. I look with equal mind on kinsman and stranger. Longing or aversion for objects have passed from me. I dwell wherever I happen to be, at the root of a tree, or in a deserted temple, or on a hill, or in the forest. I wander here and there, without ties or expectations, in search of the highest good, accepting any scraps I chance to get by begging. So this is this man just turning up and talking to the Buddha, explaining what his life is. And you notice this again, this theme. I make no distinction between kinsmen and strangers. Everybody is treated equally. There's equal loving kindness for everybody. This is a very, very important theme, I think, in what becomes the Buddha's going forth, what a real spiritual practitioner does and is. They treat everybody equally. They don't make distinctions. They live very, very simply indeed. I know many of you listening have your families and your loved ones and responsibilities to your families. I'm not suggesting that you all just walk out the door. You can't at the moment anyway, because we're all in lockdown. But the sign, the mark of real spiritual development, no matter what one's status, one of the immediate signs is treating everybody equally. Equal metta. No distinctions between likes and dislikes. That's one of the great signs of genuine spiritual development, genuine going forth. You've put down all the complexities and all the worries of likes and dislikes. They've gone because you're living for something much more profound. You're trying to discover the nature of liberation, the nature of life. But then a strange thing happens. After saying this, the mendicant flew up into the sky, vanishing into the clouds before the prince's very eyes. He was a sky dweller who had seen other Buddhas and wished to rouse the prince's attention. It's very, very strange, isn't it? This is the sort of thing you get in a Sanskrit work like this sort of miraculous, almost visionary moment. I think you can interpret it in all sorts of ways. You know, in the tradition, it would be taken literally that a god, if you like, decided, well, we've got to make sure that this man goes forth, just like the other Buddhas did. So we've got to go down and encourage him and give him a vision. Or it could just be that. What the prince, the bodhisattva, is seeing is his own future. What his life is actually going to be. It's a vision of what he can become. It's not the vision of becoming a Buddha, it's the vision of the life devoted to searching for liberation. When he had gone like a bird into the sky, the best of men was full of gladness and wonder. Gladness and wonder. The Sanskrit has words like thrill and amazement as well. And having thus gained an awareness of the truth, he set his mind on the way to leave his home. So this is what the vision opens up for him. He knows he's now got to leave home. He's got to find a way of doing that. He's got to break out of this imprisoning life, which is just not conducive to finding the truth of things. I've said before, probably at the Sangha night, I think one of the great repressed areas of Buddhism, especially contemporary Buddhism, if you like the shadow side, is the Buddha's renunciation, is the general theme of renunciation. You know, we all love the Buddha, we love the stories, but we forget that he gave everything up. He gave absolutely everything up. You know, he gave up family, gave up home, gave up all material, security and happiness to just live this wandering life right out in the open. Everything stripped back to the essentials to discover liberation. Now, as I've already said, that's very difficult for all of us, myself included. But nonetheless, there's a teaching there, and maybe that's something you can reflect on in the coming weeks as we move towards the Buddha's enlightenment. Perhaps there are questions, well, how can I do something like that? Or what does that mean for me, given my circumstances, given my situation? It's very interesting what comes next in Ashvaghosha's text. He says, and so, as powerful as Indra, that's one of the great gods, as powerful as Indra, with the powerful horses of his senses tamed, the prince mounted his horse, wishing to get started on going into the forest and living the life of a mendicant. But then, having regard for his people, he turned his horse around again and did not go directly to the longed-for forest. In other words, he wants to go back home, go back to the city, go back to his family to tell them what he's going to do. He feels a great responsibility to them, a connection with them, a bond with them. This is, again, a very, very interesting detail. So it makes it clear that it's not an irresponsible going forth. It's highly responsible. I mean, sometimes people can say they're going forth from something or somebody, but actually they're just going from one material thing to another material thing. They go forth from one relationship to another romantic relationship. which they might say is a kind of going forth. Well, no, that's not what going forth is. It's a responsible going forth. You care very, very deeply for your nearest and dearest. You care very deeply for the whole of life, and your going forth is coming out of that. Then he entered the city again. It was not out of any wish to do so, since he desired to make an end of old age and death, and had fixed his mind with full attention on living in the forest. His feelings were those of a mighty elephant returning from the jungle, entering a ring. It was a really, really interesting image. So he'd become, on that visit out into the jungle, he'd become a great free elephant. He'd sort of liberated himself. And now he was going back to the city, back to the ring where the elephant could be staked and be enclosed. But he wasn't going to be defined by that. It's a very, very interesting detail. So perhaps indicating that, we can be in the world, but not of it. But he's definitely on the way out, the Buddha to be, the Bodhisattva. And then there's a very interesting little detail, which I'll read and then we'll come to an end of the talk. So he's riding through the city, going to the palace. A nobleman's daughter, looking up at him, so there's this nobleman's daughter looking up at this prince on his horse, this very powerful, very handsome figure, very, very contained, very determined. A nobleman's daughter, looking up at him as he entered the road, folded her hands and said, "Happy indeed, and supremely blessed is that woman whose husband is one like you, O long-eyed one." It must have been very handsome, very beautiful. When he, the prince, the Bodhisattva, heard these plaintive words, he whose voice was like that of a battle cry, like a roaring thundercloud, was filled with profound calm. So he hears these words from this probably beautiful noblewoman's daughter. He's filled with profound calm. For as he heard the words, "supremely blessed," he set his mind on the means of winning the happiness of supreme nirvana. There's a play on words in the Sanskrit that you can't replicate in English. I tried, but I couldn't do it, because the words that the woman uses at seeing him is, I've translated it as supremely blessed. It's nivritta, nivrita. Nivrita means something like supreme satisfaction, but it's related to the word nirvana. So it's trying to evoke the highest, the supreme happiness. I guess it would be a bit like saying, happy indeed. And it would be like being in nirvana to have a man like that. That would be my nirvana, if I had a man of that beauty and handsomeness and nobility. But for the Bodhisattva, when he hears that word nivrita, nirvana, that's what he hears. She's announcing his goal. And all he longs for then is to win, to attain supreme nirvana, the liberation from birth and death. I find this a very, very interesting insight of Ashvaghosha, and again, presumably it's based on traditional sources, that the prince's awareness, the Bodhisattva's awareness, is so heightened. It's so in tune with the emerging dharma, the emerging way within him, the emerging path. It's so full of wisdom that even the expression of such love, of his beauty, expressed in terms of nivrita, he hears that as a teaching. He hears that as a call for him to follow the path fully to nirvana. It's very, very interesting that this whole sense in which our awareness can transform anything onto the path. Perhaps the stories that we're hearing at the moment are particularly difficult ones in the world outside. Perhaps we're also hearing wonderful stories about people's nobility and their generosity. Perhaps as well this sort of enforced seclusion and isolation that we're having is making us more heightened to the reality around us. Well, let's follow the Bodhisattva. Let's listen with the ears of a Bodhisattva. Let's see with the eyes of a Bodhisattva, somebody aspiring to enlightenment. Let's take every sound, every utterance as a teaching on the path to liberation from the round of birth and death, the reactive mind. Let's hear everything as pointing towards the attainment of enlightenment. Thank you very much for listening, dear friends in Sheffield. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you enjoy Sangha night, virtual Sangha night, and may we soon, inspired by the Dharma, meet again in happiness and boon. Thank you.